Thank you, everybody, for attending. We'll get started now. A few more participants may trickle in as we get going, but I think we're off to a good start. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar hosted by the Stationers Company with assistance from Westchester Publishing Services. To officially kick us off, I want to introduce Tony Mash, the master of the Worshipful Company of Stationers.
Tyler, thank you very much indeed. I hope everybody can hear me. This is London calling, which is an old phrase from the past. But as the master of the Worshipful Company of Stationers and Newspaper Makers, it's an organization which was the first in the world to develop and then implement the concept of copyright. I'm particularly excited by this event since it not only focuses on a topic that's at the very heart of our company, but it also reflects the growing role of our North American members in our activities. We do have a history that goes right back to the development of a guild of scribes and illuminators in London in 1403. We embraced the printing press technology of the 1480s and the other technological and commercial developments over the centuries, and have now developed into a company composed of 1,000 members who share experience and interests across the communications and content industries, not just in the UK, but also around the world. This does not have solely a UK focus, but it includes links to what is going on in Europe and North America, and we're very active, I know, in the United States. Stationers were active in supporting the first importation of the printing presses in both Boston and Philadelphia, and the early copyright laws in the United States in the 1790s were based, at least part, on the UK's own Statute of Anne, which dates from 1710. It was the leadership of Lorraine Shanley, Tyler Carey, and Oliver Gadsby who helped promote the Stationers Company in North America. And we in the UK heartily welcome the growing number of Americans and Canadians who are now part of the organization. As I watch the stock markets of the world, I can see that the US stock market is particularly excited by the prospects of AI and is devoting significant attention and resource to its development and exploitation. It's therefore only right that today's discussion is driven for the first time by our North American colleagues, itself a milestone worthy of celebration. As a fellow American, I proudly congratulate the organizing team for this event and look forward to hearing what you will all have to say concerning the prospects of AI and also its impact on rights and intellectual property. You never know, after listening to the conversation today, I may decide to go out and buy some more shares. Who knows? Anyway, thank you very much indeed for participating, and hope that it's a very successful venture. I'm sure it will be. All the best.
Thank you very much. And we'll echo your thanks specifically for Lorraine Shanley, Roger Rosen, Michael Healy, and Roy Kaufman from the Stationers in North America for helping put today's event together. Want to thank the panel for their expertise and time, and the company, including Jill Jones from the Industry Committee, Karen Keating, and Lucy McCord for helping sponsor the event. I also want to thank Nicole Tomasi from Westchester Publishing Services, where I work with Nicole, and we're helping administer today's event. But now Roy Kaufman from Copyright Clearance Center to moderate things and take us off.
Thanks, Tyler. I was going to thank lots of people, but I think you've done enough for me, so I'm going to skip some of that and just thank all the attendees for coming here. I think it's going to be a really interesting panel. We've got 3 amazing speakers from different aspects of our community, all of whom think quite a lot, write a lot, talk a lot about artificial intelligence. And so it's going to be great. A little bit of housekeeping on how this is going to happen. First of all, the bios were online and when you registered, so I'm not going to spend the next 30 minutes reading what they've written. Everyone here is extraordinarily accomplished. Each of the speakers is going to have 5 to 10 minutes to speak. I will do my best to enforce that limit. I don't think I'll have to. At the end of which we will have discussion and Q&A. If you wish to ask questions, please type them into the Q&A, not the chat, which has been disabled if we did it appropriately. And you can ask questions to everyone. You can direct those questions, but we will not be answering any questions until all three speakers have finished. Just want to say also thank you to the stationers. I'm a new stationer. I know I took a look at the participant list. A lot of you are stationers. If you're not, please do consider joining. It's great to be in the company of scribes, but really to be in the company of illuminators. What a great title. I think that's going to be my new job title. I'm going to be an illuminator in the future because that can mean almost anything. I'm sure it meant something then. I know exactly what it meant then. Now it could mean something different. And with that, our order of speakers, we're going to start with Jane Friedman, who's going to be talking about perspectives from the author community. So, Jane, over to you.
Thank you so much, Roy. I do have some visuals to share, which you should now see on your screen. So my perspective, as Roy said, is from the author community. I'm an author myself. I also report on the book publishing industry. And authors have a lot of mixed emotions right now about what's happening with AI. They're angry in many cases about their work being used to train the models without their consent. They're fearful about what's going to happen next, and they're appalled at what's happening right now. So, and I serve as an example of some of the things that are happening right now, because last summer, there were 6 books published to my name that I did not put up myself, that I did not write. It's actually not copyright infringement, or it's in a really gray area of whether or not it's infringement or not. They're simply books that have been written by AI in the spirit of the sorts of things I'm known for, the sorts of books that I write and publish. I actually only have one book to my name. It's called The Business of Being a Writer. The covers that you see here on the slide were all of the books that were available for sale on Amazon, that were attached to my Goodreads profile, and that had been up for many weeks, actually, until a very kind reader let me know that they were available. I did get them taken down, but it was a pretty frightening experience how difficult it was to get Amazon to take them down, because they didn't see infringement here. It really took a PR nightmare for them to get them to act. So this is a problem. Now, there are lots of different types of AI-generated materials that are hitting Amazon. Here is one example of an AI-generated book and an actual authentic human-authored book. Can you tell the difference? Which one is which? Ted Gioia is a prominent jazz critic in the United States. He recently found a book called The Evolution of Jazz listed on Amazon that didn't quite have his name, but was clearly trying to trick people into thinking that maybe this was by a jazz expert by using the name Frank Gioia and then a co-author name of Ted Alkier. So this is something that, again, he had to fight Amazon to have it taken down because it was fooling people into thinking it was a legitimate work with his expertise. Another example from earlier this year is a book that hit the New York Times bestseller list, Mostly What God Does by Savannah Guthrie. She's a host of a morning show in the United States. The book was unexpectedly popular, so popular it actually ran out of copies. Amazon ran out of stock to ship, and so that's when all of the AI-generated material flooded the market, hoping to take advantage of people thinking this was the real thing when it wasn't. Her name's Savannah Guthrie, but the AI-generated book just tweaked her name a little bit into Guthrie, hoping that people wouldn't notice. And of course, I imagine some of you have seen how frequently AI-generated books go up for sale on Amazon about public figures. I believe there was one about King Charles after he was diagnosed or announced his diagnosis of cancer. And these books flood onto the market every single day. One of your own journalists, Rory Cathleen Jones, put out a memoir, Ruskin Park, not long ago, and he was flabbergasted to receive an email from Amazon itself telling him about a new book he might like, a biography by someone else that he did not know, AI generated. The problem takes so many forms. Now, pollution of the Amazon marketplace is certainly not new, but AI has accelerated the sorts of materials that are really low quality, junk, garbage, and sometimes outright fraudulent. New York Times did a really big piece on the prolific number of travel guides now available that fool people all the time. And if you read this article, you'll see like unsuspecting readers saying, yeah, I got a few chapters in and it didn't actually seem like all that helpful of a book. And it took them a while before they understood this wasn't written by a human, it was just AI generated. Sometimes these books can potentially cause harm. There was an article last year about AI generated mushroom foraging books. Obviously, if you are given incorrect information about foraging mushrooms, you could end up with something that's poisonous rather than something you actually want to put in your mouth. And sometimes people will say, well, this is just affecting Amazon. It's not that big of a problem. But in fact, Amazon distributes to all of the major retailers around the world. There was one book in particular, Fire and Fury, which purported to be about the Maui fires in 2023. It came out before the fires had even stopped burning, and it made its way onto Barnes & Noble and quickly became a category bestseller. At least with Amazon, when they're alerted to the problem, they typically will take it down right away after it gets the PR nightmare facing it. But the books are still distributed, and it takes them longer to come down off of distribution at places like Barnes & Noble. So Amazon has taken a couple of steps to try and stem the tide here. One thing that they did was restrict authors from self-publishing more than 3 books a day. But I'm here to tell you that hasn't really done much to reduce the volume of material. People just create new accounts to publish the books. And they've also asked authors behind the scenes to check a box that basically says this content is AI generated. But so far, that is only for Amazon's internal use. That information is not revealed to the consumer. So we have an entire marketplace that we don't know as readers or consumers whether the book is human authored, AI generated. There's absolutely no transparency. There are, of course, other ways that the training models are allowing very questionable things to be done, things that ought to be licensed and paid for. So recently, the Authors Guild filed a lawsuit. This was in the fall of last year on behalf of novelists. And one of their exhibits was this particular site, Social Draft, which has chatbots based on best-selling authors that have been trained on their work. I myself, as someone who's very active in the writing and publishing community, receive lots of questions from writers who are now very frightened to even use basic AI tools in their day-to-day work. Grammarly is a very popular software that helps them correct grammar and proofread their work, and they're now afraid of using that because they're worried about getting tainted with some sort of AI process, or that this software is going to ingest their work and use it unfairly. And we're starting to see in reader groups, this is from a particular Facebook group, the readers themselves are upset. They're upset on behalf of authors. They're upset for their own experiences. They're starting to ban any book that they can find that has use of AI, whether that's on the cover design or on the interior. So this is, for authors, a really significant issue that they're thinking about pretty much every day. Worried about it in terms of their working process, how it will affect their relationship with publishers, and they're also very much looking to publishers for solutions for how to move forward. And that's it.
Thank you, Jane. That was wonderful. To a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I always think of copyright implications, and we can get into this in the Q&A, but clearly there's a trademark right of publicity and passing off concerns, at least vis-a-vis US law, that I haven't really thought about, even though I think about AI all the time. So I'm going to hand this over to Katrina, and Katrina's going to talk about legal developments primarily in the UK, but like any of us lawyers / policy wonks on this issue, this is a global issue. And so if you are focusing on the UK, you're also looking at the US and the EU and maybe Singapore and Japan and a couple other places. So with that, Katrina, over to you.
Thanks, Roy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a lawyer by background. I'm General Counsel and Deputy CEO of the Publishers Association. And I think it's interesting to have listened to or seen the results of that poll. It's quite a nice starting point for what I was going to say first, which is where we always start on this topic, which is, of course, it is both an opportunity and a threat. And I think while publishers have long engaged with AI, the advent and public release of large language models, such as ChatGPT, which are trained on vast quantities of copyright protected works in order to create the human-like text, have brought challenges to the fore and really multiplied publishers' and authors' concerns, as we've just heard. And of course, in order to create that text, these models must be trained on huge quantities of works. And we know from our own analysis, and that done by others, of the Books3 dataset, upon which many of the high-profile models have been trained, that hundreds of thousands of books subject to copyright are within the training data. And of course, that poses two really significant and related threats to the book and journal sector. The first being the threat to human creativity, and the second being the threat to based on intellectual property. And in the UK, the kind of legal and political landscape in which this is playing out is really interesting. We are at the moment waiting to see what the UK government's landing ground will be. About 18 months ago, just over, the government basically proposed to blow open copyright law here by introducing an exception to copyright law for text and data mining for any purpose with no right holder opt-out. And in the face of pretty significant resistance from the Publishers Association, but also the wider industry, including you, Roy, and our counterparts across the creative industries, this was abandoned eventually. And interestingly, even the large platforms themselves weren't looking for that particular option in terms of the consultation that had been run about it. But there remained huge political interest, of course, in AI and its potential to support the UK as a superpower for science and innovation. But as we know, that really requires getting the regulation of it right. And our government then published a white paper on the regulation of AI, but neither that nor the consultation that followed it, and not even the AI summit that took place in the UK last autumn, grappled with the issues around intellectual property. Those were to be dealt with through a roundtable process convened by our Intellectual Property Office at the direction of government, and it was tasked with bringing rights holders and AI companies together to create a voluntary code of conduct. But unsurprisingly to many of us, that ended in an impasse. And it really isn't surprising when you think about it, because you've got sort of Microsoft and Stability AI in the room at the table, but they're involved in active litigation in relation to these exact issues. So you're unlikely to get any form of concession from them around whether they need any kind of permission or a license to do what they're doing in that kind of forum. So where we are now is that the government departments, known as DCMS and DCIT, so the Science, Technology and Innovation one and the Culture and Media one, they're now taking this matter forward, and we await sort of ministerial direction. And there were supposed to be further roundtables proposed with the kind of different sides of the debate separately, but they didn't start in the timeframe we expected. And of course, we're now in a position where we're heading for a general election this year in the UK. And of course, if they were to introduce any new primary legislation, that is now not going to happen before that general election. So we're sort of in an interesting point, really. And in the meantime, the UK House of Lords conducted a really interesting inquiry into large language models. And our CEO and many others from the creative industries gave evidence to that, I think also including you, Roy. And that concluded very helpfully to us that the government cannot sit on its hands while large language models exploit the works of right holders for huge financial gain. And it criticized tech firms for using data without permission or compensation, and encouraged the government to end the copyright dispute definitively, using legislation if necessary. And that's a quote from their report. It called for greater transparency for rights holders to see if their work had been used without consent, and for investment in data sets to encourage tech firms to pay for licensed content. So really echoing all the things that, that we and others have been asking for. And shortly thereafter, the government's response to the white paper on AI regulation came out. And again, that recognized the importance of ensuring AI development supports rather than undermines human creativity and innovation, and the provision of trustworthy information, because of course there's important research integrity points here as well. In terms of the international picture, of course, we are no longer part of the EU, but right next to it, and our neighbours over there have introduced legislation on AI. But first of all, they have a piece of legislation which introduced a exception to copyright law for text and data mining, but with a right holder opt-out, interestingly. That was obviously written, and prepared several years ago now, before we all had Gen AI in our pockets. And so it's quite interesting to see that now playing out with the picture that we now have in front of us. And what's interesting to see now is that the EU having to, I guess, address the copyright implications that arise by bringing in the sort of transparency measures that they are bringing in the EU AI Act, in order, if you like, to make that exception work, if that's sort of the intention. So it'll be interesting to see how things play out in the UK, bearing in mind that legislation is now in going forward in the EU. I think I would urge caution around the thinking that a kind of EU-like exception with an opt-out will not receive pushback from right holders, and that it's somehow a kind of middle ground or path of least resistance. I don't think it's that straightforward. An exception to copyright with an opt-out, what that does is it actually makes copyright opt-in, and copyright is supposed to arise automatically, but actually what an exception with an opt-out does is makes it that you have to opt in for it. So if you think about somebody performing a song in a bar, are they going to rush off and opt out that content before it's videoed and put onto the internet and used as machine food for AI? So that's an interesting one. And then there's also still quite a lot of practical and technical reasons why opt-out is not quite a perfect solution, in the sense that, for example, if you lift content out of a website, even if that website is opted out, if you lift the content out, the opt-out can't travel with it, so it's then lost. So there are still a few challenges. And then we heard earlier about the impact of all of this on authors, and appending copyright in this way puts a burden directly on creators. I mean, are authors and other creators going to be able to manage this? They're in a very different position from a large right holder with lots of resources at its disposal. So I do think there are still a number of questions. Of course, we are delighted that the UK is not proceeding with an exception with no opt-out, but I think there's some important observing to be done of how that is all going to work. Beyond EU, there are some countries where they have exceptions which appear to permit the training of AI models in a way that is incredibly broad and arguably not compliant with their obligations under international law. So again, it will be interesting to see how that plays out. But the EU have very smartly introduced a provision saying that models that are made available in the EU must not just comply with, wherever they were trained, but they must comply with the law of the EU. And that is the type of provision that any country trying to legislate in this area should have squarely in mind. Just another word on an important part of this, which is transparency. I said that the EU is bringing in these transparency measures to sort of make workable the TDM exception. I think what's important is, and we have always said that our copyright framework is fit for purpose. It just needs to be respected and enforced. The problem we have at the moment is, without transparency about what has already been used, that's very difficult to do. If you're going into a licensing discussion, you need to know what you're discussing licensing. So you need to understand what has already been used in order to say whether you would permit it. So this transparency is very important, kind of looking back and looking forward. Of course, transparency is just one of many things. We've always said there are four. It's permission, it's transparency, it's remuneration, and it's attribution. Those are the kind of four things you need in any kind of solution here. And again, in the EU, it's still not totally resolved how this will work, because they make reference to this sufficiently detailed summary that must be provided, but what does that mean? So still some open questions really in terms of how that's all going to fit together. And Roy, with that, I'll hand back to you, but happy to delve into some other areas later on.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning the extraterritorial aspects of the EU Act. And just people might not know this yet, but we actually had legislation proposed on transparency in the US just yesterday, I believe. CCC gave a statement of support. That's all on LinkedIn. But like you and your election, we have an election coming up. So whether something like that gets passed is a big open question. Okay, so I'm going to turn this now over to Mark Milstein. Now, Mark and I actually met in the context of something Katrina was talking about, which was that effort by the UK government to bring a bunch of disparate interests together to see if we could come up with some licensing best practices. Now, Mark is an entrepreneur in this field, also just thinks a lot about these matters, and I'm going to hand it over now to him. So thanks, Mark, for being here.
Thank you very much to everyone. First, a trigger alert. I will not be as eloquent, knowledgeable, or masterful of the subject matter as either Jane or Katrina. But I do promise to add some layer of information to this discussion that absolutely will leave everybody scratching their heads and wondering where we're all headed. And that's just because there is no clarity at this very moment. I sort of would like to discuss a couple of things, but I'll start off with what I call the original sin. The original sin, when relating to visual media and copyright, which is the area that I expressly focus on, started off in August of 2021 with the creation of something called the Lion 5B dataset. Lion is spelled L-A-I-O-N, not lion as in large carnivorous cat. And it was a project that was funded in a most opaque and almost near criminal-like manner by Stability AI, when they gave money to a professor of visual media and 2 PhD students in Germany to create this data set of content. The Lion 5B dataset does not host the content of scraped images themselves. Rather, the dataset contains URLs pointing to the images, which then researchers must download themselves. And strangely enough, and I find very interesting that, so this data set became the basis, the training data, which then spun up and sort of sparked life into Stable Diffusion. Stable Diffusion is the main engine by which most text-to-image synthesis models are based upon. Users type in a simple prompt, happy woman on a beach throwing a frisbee with a golden retriever puppy, and it immediately generates an image based upon that data set. And everybody is just really amazed. Strangely enough, there were marketplaces already in existence to copyright, to license that copyrighted data, places like Shutterstock, Getty, and others. Yet, despite all that, these technology companies decided to do this type of a methodology and completely cut out all copyright opportunities. In fact, I think the operative word at this moment is something I would call chaos. Generative AI, unlike any other technology, has unleashed chaos on its target markets. And I think we can sort of divide the kinds of companies that I've come upon into 3 different verticals. Companies which have decided to adhere to current copyright standards of licensing through a variety of channels and developing products which are seen as both legal and ethical. But these companies are in the minority, and unfortunately, they're probably rarer than honest politicians or pink unicorns. There are very, very few companies, at least in the visual media sphere, that are currently licensing their content. And the second vertical is companies which stick to the viewpoints that fair use is a law, and that copyright is not applicable, and that according to their legal shamans, they are following this to the letter. Their products were developed by scraping the web for data and or by bolting a user interface onto an existing legally toxic product like Midjourney or Stable Diffusion, or even a quasi-legal platform like OpenAI's DALL-E. And this seems to be where a large portion of tech companies now reside. They're neither wholly legal, but they're not wholly illegal. They're wholly, they have mixed a variety of both licensed content that they might have gotten through the likes of a Getty Image or a Shutterstock or any other kind of a licensable marketplace or licensing marketplace, and or they might have scraped the web for content and done so out of complete naivete that they have the rights to that content, and that is okay because their legal review has been rather what I call light. And then there is the third vertical, which are companies that have mined their own data or their own consumer data to create their internally facing or consumer facing products. This, I think, is the majority of technology platforms that we come into contact with now. Many of these companies have done it right, but an equal number of those companies have done so without fully understanding the rights they might have or might not have regarding that data. And so there's an incredible dearth of information available to them, and I think that's expressly related to the lack of concrete directive from the U.S. Copyright Office. Unfortunately, this lack of direction continues to fuel this chaotic landscape, and we pretty much grapple with all of this on a daily basis. The lack of clarity combined with an enormous deficit of sound guidelines and best practices continues to muddy the waters and reduces the development of legally clean products. And while there are some answers, where does it leave us? I dare say that there is no clear path. I don't have a clear answer at this very moment. I wonder openly on a given on a daily basis. The previous poll showed that most people think about AI or focus on this subject with a minimal amount of hours per day. Myself, like Roy, I find myself focusing, in perhaps 30, 40 hours a day. I know it's impossible to have a 30-hour workday, but yet, despite that, it feels as if I am spending the majority of my time and then some, trying to come up with an answer. And without, again, the lack of guidelines is what is driving the complete chaos that pretty much permeates this landscape. And there doesn't seem to be at this very moment any kind of a way out. I go back to my original statement about this original sin being created, this data set being readily available, companies using this data set to create and generate new products. There doesn't seem to be any sort of an incentive by large companies or by companies that have created text to image synthesis models to go to a licensed model. This despite, again, there being inordinate numbers of channels to license content, and that have been in place now for somewhat upwards of 40, 50, 60 years. The stock media industry, the licensable stock media industry, is not something that's new. It didn't come into being as a result of generative AI. It has been there since the end of the Second World War, and has served publishers and others, and the advertising agencies and others for decades. I think one of the arguments that came up in part of my day-to-day discourse on LinkedIn and elsewhere has been that the number of licensable content, the numbers of licensable content, is not enough to create a usable foundation model. In other words, that's what many of these tech companies say. They said that they don't have enough content, that the licensable content, if it was taken as a whole, equals perhaps a little bit more than 1 billion to 1.5 billion pieces of content, and that's far less than they need in order to create a model which produces a one-to-one fidelity with real photography. It's almost the equivalent of somebody going around and stealing the mirror off of your car, the car seat out of your car, the rear bumper, the front bumper, the hood, and so on and so forth, and then constructing a new car, and then standing there and saying, well, I had to go out and steal all these pieces because I couldn't construct this model any other way. It's an argument which I think holds no weight, but unfortunately, without a directive and a directive from the U.S. Copyright Office, a judgment from any kind of a court or a legal forum, these kinds of arguments continue to carry lots of weight. The fair use argument continues to permeate much of the discourse as well, where tech companies openly state that fair use gives them the right to scrape content that is available on the internet for their own use. And I find that argument really almost inconceivable and very, very difficult to even swallow. But yet it continues to remain part of the conversation. And in fact, it's even more surprising how many legal minds, how many attorneys, barristers, so forth, continue to be, the loudest voices in that particular forum or that particular area. I don't have a concrete and a what I call nicely bow-tied box of a summation here. I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. All I can tell you is that the technology is shifting rapidly, whereas it might have only taken, at one time in the very beginning, 2 years ago, it took billions of images to create a foundation model to support a one-to-one fidelity with photography. There are models that are now currently being developed, which absolutely will reduce that argument, the argument of fair use, the argument that we don't have enough content available to us in copyrighted, marketplaces, that those new models now require vastly reduced sums of data. And so I will now stop at this very moment and turn the forum back up to over to Roy.
I did warn you I would call a hard stop. So thank you very much for that, Mark. So I'm going to just do a closing thought. I know we're really out of time, other than to thank everyone. There was a question / comment where Ian Locke said, copyright was initially a simple concept. Are we trying to extend and overcomplicate a simple concept? So I'm just going to leave us with a thought. Copyright should still be simple. And the fact that we're having this discussion now is no different from the conversation for piano player rolls and talkies and radios. Every time there's a new technology, there's someone who says, this system is broken and overly complex, we need to throw it out. This is just a repeat. Now it happens every 2 years as opposed to every 2 decades. But it is a simple concept. You own the rights. You have the right, you have the exclusive rights. People should get your consent. That's my soapbox. And with that, I'm going to stop because I'm now officially made us over time. And there's a thank you slide. And again, thanks to everyone. This has been awesome. Oh, follow all the speakers on LinkedIn and other places. And a lot of these questions will be answered because we are all very active on these. So if you follow us on LinkedIn, you'll hear us talking about these cases or the legislative things. Thanks.
Roy, Katrina, Mark, Jen, Nicole, thank you so much for making this a very interesting hour, and one that's actually confused me quite a lot, but I'm sure that confuses everybody. You've been great. And it's wonderful to see a lovely dialogue across the Atlantic, the pond, as they call it. All the best to everybody.